Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending today's in-service on sex offender information. My name is Joel Galvan, and I'll be your presenter for today's topic. I'm representing the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. I was asked here today by the Janesville Chief of Police. In my audience, I have Janet Galvan, Marcia Galvan, my recorder, Gabrielle Huey. The focus of this training is not intended so that you can go back in your communities and point out every sex offender that you see, but instead to give you, the police and the community, a sense of awareness, understanding, and overall knowledge on the subject. This training will give you a strong base of knowledge to take back into your community and better prepare you for any day-to-day encounters. The more you know, the better you can protect yourself and your families. So what is a sex offender, you ask? Well, a sex offender is any person who commits a crime involving a sexual act. This is really a generic term for all persons convicted of crimes involving sex. This includes rape, molestation, sexual harassment, sexual conduct with a minor, pornography production, and distribution. Are any of you familiar with your own community? Sex offenders in your community?
I think there's this place called Rockville Community Programs up the way. I think they have sex offenders up there.
That's true. Rock Valley Community Programs does have correctional facilities that does house sex offenders. That's right here in Janesville. I'm requesting that each one of you goes home tonight and takes just a few minutes. Go ahead and review your city or state's sex offender registry list. I think you'll be shocked as to what you might actually find out. I did a search of my own community recently, and I found that right here in my own community, there were numerous registered sex offenders, several in my own neighborhood. So how many offenders are in Wisconsin, do you think? Any guesses?
Couple thousand.
Couple thousand?
Million?
Any guesses? Million's a little high, but according to homefacts.com, there are 12,934 registered offenders in Wisconsin. Right? Wisconsin has a ration of 22.59 offenders per every 10,000 residents. There are about 423 sex offenders in Wisconsin who are currently incarcerated. The rest are back living in the streets today. In addition, there are approximately 200 transient sex offenders whose current whereabouts are unknown. So they may be living under a bridge, they may be living in your next door neighbor's house. We don't really know. We cannot account for them at this time. What rationales are used by policymakers to distinguish sex offenders? Any guesses?
No.
Well, the quick answer is that it's complicated. But there are two general principal arguments that are used by lawmakers to justify laws for sex offenders. One, the impact of sexual abuse on the victims and society. And two, the high rates of recidivism rates by sex offenders. Of course, there are countless variables, and each of these cases is different. This topic would require an in-service to itself, so we'll move on to the next topic. What kind of impact does sexual abuse have on its victims and society?
On the victim and the crime.
It can depend on the victim and the crime. Sexual assault is associated with greater psychological harm than other crimes. Research has shown that there to be a serious long-term trauma for victims of both rape and child sexual assault. With children, there's a direct correlation that suggests that the abused often become the abuser later on in life. So an example is a young child living with abusive parents. Maybe dad does some sort of sexual exploitation to the child. That child is more likely to grow up and abuse their own children.
How come they take children who are being sexually abused by their parents as a lesser threat to society. If that's the case.
Well, I actually touched base on that later on in the presentation. But the idea behind that is that parents, for example, are not, or a child living in a home to abusive parents, right? Those children are at risk, but other members of the community are not at risk. So they basically don't deem those people as that much of a threat to the community because it's just within their household. Victims typically experience fear and terror-related symptoms following such a violent and traumatic experiences. These experiences often result in PTSD for the victim. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is defined as a mental health condition that is triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. Symptoms may include flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts about the event.
Perhaps substance abuse?
Yes, so that's often correlated with sexual abuse. People oftentimes self-medicate, take drugs and alcohol to cope with those feelings of anxiety and stress. Oftentimes, victims who experience traumatic events have difficulty adjusting and coping. Symptoms may last for months or even years. Does anyone here know anyone who is the victim of a sexual assault? You do? Do they ever talk about how they feel?
Sometimes, but she's an alcoholic and she smokes marijuana regularly.
So we can't say for certain that it's because of that, but it could certainly be a contributing factor. Children with histories of sexual abuse have been found to suffer from increased anxiety and depression, somatic complaints, social withdrawal, anger and aggression, substance abuse, and sexual behavior problems than adult victims do. It's unfortunate that so many sexual assault crimes go unreported. A 2008 study conducted by the NCVS revealed that an estimated 595 of sexual assaults, 59.5% of sexual assaults or rapes go unreported to law enforcement. Amber Stevenson, a clinical supervisor and therapist at the Sexual Assault Center, said that one reason above all else was responsible for deterring victims from coming forward and reporting their crimes. She said, "As long as we as a community can continue to make victim-blaming statements such as, 'She put herself in that situation,' 'She didn't even fight back, she must have wanted it,' those things will ensure that we will continue to see these rapes and assaults go unreported. We need to stop blaming the victim and shift the conversation towards the people committing the crimes." Has anyone here ever heard of Megan's Law? No one? Okay. Megan's Law is an informal name for laws in the United States requiring law enforcement authorities to make information available to the public regarding registered sex offenders. This was created in response to the murder of Megan Kanka. Individual states decide what information will be made available and how it should be disseminated. Commonly included information is the offender's name, picture, address, incarceration date, and nature of the crime. The information is often displayed on free public websites, but can be published in newspapers, distributed in pamphlets, or through various other means. At the federal level, this is better known as the Sexual Offender Jacob Wetterling Act of 1994. With advances in technology, such as the internet and subsequent chat rooms and social media websites, so has advanced the sexual offender agenda. Online child molesters often use the internet as a tool to gain access to youth, establish trust and rapport, introduce discussions about sex, and arrange face-to-face meetings with underage victims. Chat rooms and social media have created created virtual environments where offenders can communicate with potential victims. This makes it important to monitor your children's internet access. I personally will not allow my own children to use the internet unsupervised, or own a smartphone for that matter, because of such threats. Of course, they will disagree with that. Have current laws and policies caused a reduction in sex crimes? Does anybody know?
Probably not.
The answer is actually yes. Sexual violence has been declining over the past decade. Explanations for the decline vary, from aging population groups to stronger economy, increased incarceration rates, increased police presence, and a decline in the actual risky behaviors themselves. At least half of the states in the U.S. have implemented mandatory minimum prison terms of 25 years for first-time felony sex offenses against children. Offenders must be placed on a sex offender registry list and update local law enforcement of any changes. Sex offender information, as said before, is free public knowledge, and the internet has made it much easier to research suspected offenders. I mentioned earlier that you guys should go home and visit some of these websites. I think you'd be surprised to know just how many of your neighbors or people you might work with are actually registered sex offenders. Many offenders have been zoned out of the vulnerable areas such as parks and schools and anywhere else that youth may congregate. The city of Milwaukee in Wisconsin has recently rezoned. The ordinance that was approved by the Common Council would restrict any serious convicted sex offenders from residing within 2,000 square feet of a school, park, playground, daycare center, or any other location where kids may congregate. This essentially makes it impossible for sex offenders to live inside the city of Milwaukee. There is, I guess you could say, a grandfather clause. People who lived can establish a history of residence for 2 years prior to committing their crime, can actually stay in the household that they were living in. However, if they can never move to another house within that city. Once that housing is up, they have to find another place to live. It's not transferable to other locations within the city.
So are sex offenders moving out of Milwaukee?
Yes, sex offenders are moving out of Milwaukee quite rapidly. So it counts for the city of Milwaukee itself. All right, so people are moving out to the suburbs or going to other counties.
People coming out of the system and going into transitional housing. Will that affect us because we have that transitional housing here?
So Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee also has used to have correctional facilities or halfway houses, residential reentry centers, whatever you want to call them. And they did used to accept sex offenders. And now with the rezoning, those sex offenders cannot even stay in those residential reentry centers, which is why you're seeing an influx in other communities. Rock Valley Community Programs in Janesville is getting all of the overflow of sex offenders from Milwaukee now. What can we do to prevent sex crimes? Well, you can make it harder for offenders to commit successful crimes by making yourself, family, and community a hard target. This can be done by learning self-defense techniques, traveling in groups, using tools or weapons, controlling internet sites, and controlling access to facilities by unknown members. We can increase the risk of being caught by offering better surveillance and lighting, extending guardianship to people who can be trusted, increase patrols, and utilizing place managers, etc. You can control prompts by removing situational triggers, by limiting provocative situations, reducing permissibility by challenging beliefs, excuses, minimizations by offenders that link behavior and consequence. This includes educational programs, codes of conduct, and policies and procedures. And by all means, know who is in your community. Report suspicious persons and behaviors. What about treatment options? Do you think sex offenders deserve to be rehabilitated? Do you think it's something that can be rehabilitated?
Depends on the crime. A lot of sex offenders just caught having sex with their underage girlfriend or boyfriend.
That's true, and that's something that kind of skews the numbers a little bit when looking at registries. Maybe an 18-year-old boyfriend gets reported by the mother of his 17-year-old girlfriend for sexual relations, and that person becomes a sexual predator, essentially. So it can skew those numbers a little bit. There are various approaches used to prevent convicted sex offenders from reoffending. These include therapy, community notifications and assessments. Sex offender programs are administered in institutions and in the community to help manage these offenders. There are cognitive behavioral approaches, right? These focus on changing thinking patterns related to sexual offending and changing deviant patterns in sexual behavior. The psychoeducational approach focuses on increasing offenders' empathy for the victim, which also teaching them to take responsibility for their sexual offenses. This may be seen in victim impact panels. Has anyone ever heard of those? You have? Do you know? Can you explain to the other audience members what you think a victim impact panel is?
Are there surveys that are taken by victims of crimes to do reports?
Not exactly. So, victim impact panel can be such as, I am the sex offender. I raped or molested somebody, hypothetically. I didn't really do those things. Okay? I was caught and convicted of my crime. Okay? Now, part of my therapy, part of my treatment is sitting in front of a group of not exactly peers, but let's say we'll call it a small group of people who were either the family members of the victim or victims themselves in a separate case. And essentially, I'm going to sit there and I'm going to tell my story, and they're going to hear me, and they're going to tell me how they feel. And I'm going to see the emotions. I'm going to feel the emotions. I'm going to feel guilty for what I've done by seeing how I hurt people. Does that kind of make sense? They also do that for drunk driving and various other
Yeah,
crimes.
support group?
I'm sorry?
Is that like a support group?
It's kind of like the opposite of a support group.
Oh, anti-support group. Gotcha.
It just almost forces a person to feel bad for what they did, kind of. You get to see the mixed emotions from all the people who are affected by those things. You get to see the other side that an assailant wouldn't normally see. They see the hurt and the hate and the discontent and the sorrow and the rehabilitation of the victim. And there is then the pharmacological approach, which uses various medications to reduce impulses. For some offenders, it may take a combination of all three approaches working together for successful results. It will certainly take a combination of treatment combined with the collaboration of various agencies and community partnerships to share and provide valuable information in the assessment of valuable information and the effectiveness of sex offender programs. In conclusion, there are 12,934 registered sex offenders in this state. They reside in every community, and they look just like you or I or anyone else. They come in all shapes and sizes, colors. They're professionals, they're teachers, they're ministers, they're professional businessmen, right? They're stay-at-home moms. They come, I mean, there's no one size fits all, right? They can be anybody. So you may see the creepy guy walking down the street and assume he's a sex offender. He may not, but your next door neighbor who seems like the nicest guy in the world, he could very well be a sex offender. Sex offender policies are shaped by two main categories: the impact of sexual abuse on the victims in society and the rates of recidivism amongst sex offenders. Sexual assault victims are impacted for extended periods of time with greater psychological harm caused by those crimes than other crimes. Victims have difficulty adjusting and coping. Children especially have been found to suffer from increased anxiety and depression, somatic complaints, social withdrawal, anger, anxiety, aggression, substance abuse, and sexual behavior problems themselves. Sexual violence has at least been declining over the last decade. Explanations for these declines obviously vary from the aging population groups, the economy, increased incarceration rates, mandatory and sentencing, increased police presence, collaboration efforts between agencies and communities, and treatment programs that were evidence-based practice. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my portion of the presentation. If you have any more questions, I'll do my best to answer those.
I would like to see the sex offenders living in my neighborhood. What website would I visit?
You can Google, I can't quote you the name of the sex offender list off of me.
I heard it's like Watchdog.
That is one, but there's several links that you can get through the Department of Corrections, through the Rock County. Excuse me, our county there's a link off the Rock County website. But yeah, there's several watch groups that post these names, but there's an actual state Wisconsin registry as well. Anything else? All right. Well, I hope that at least gives you a basis of understanding. Till next time. Thank you.